Recently, it's been World Book Day, where we celebrate reading across the world. However, in 2025, will we still have World Book Day, or will the Kindles and technology have taken over? I'm going to investigate this question. I'm going to interview an English teacher and a children's author. Do you find that being an author helps you with teaching?
Surprisingly, not as much as you would think, because being an author is a very instinctive thing, whereas teaching is a very conscious thing. So teaching writing is something that you do very consciously, and sort of thinking about the way that language is organised and arranged. And actually, in the beginning, in the first draft, writing is much more to do with intuition. Afterwards, obviously, you have to go back over your work and draft it and think about what features you've used and what structures you've used. But in some senses, it makes teaching more difficult, because sometimes I just want students to be creative.
Do you find being a children's author helps you relate to the students?
Yes. I'm a children's author because I'm still a child inside, and so I'd like to think that that means that I engage with people, with students on their level.
Does the school and teaching inspire your stories?
I don't write school stories very often, actually, so probably not. Although it has to be said that some of the people that I've met along the way, I've never used them actually as characters, but I have used maybe things that I've noticed about them.
Do you use technology to write your books or paper?
Paper in the first instance, usually, especially if I'm writing a picture book, because somehow there's a better connection between my brain and my right hand than there is between my brain and both hands typing, although I can touch type. And I actually prefer to write with a pencil on paper. I'm probably quicker at it, and also it's much more automatic, so I can access what's going on in my head better.
I just have some questions about the subject of English generally. Okay. Do you find that Year 7 to Year 9 is mostly preparing for GCSE?
I try not to think about preparation for GCSE, because I try to teach a subject that I love in a way that I hope will make it accessible to students. I suppose that everything that you do, right from the very beginning when you're tiny, when you begin to learn to speak, up through learning to read and write in primary school, and then learning more sophisticated techniques as you go through secondary school. I suppose it's all preparation for GCSE, but I like to think of it more as preparation for life than preparation for a particular exam.
Do you think that having one English lesson per fortnight just reading is beneficial to the students?
You mean the library?
Yeah, the library lesson.
It's difficult because I don't have any empirical evidence that it helps. I do like to think that it takes the pressure off attainment and targets, and that actually we should always remember that there are two sorts of reading. One is for business and one is for pleasure, but that many people read for pleasure, and I don't think we should lose sight of that. So I suppose in that sense it is beneficial, but I know that there are people a lot of students who actually don't enjoy reading, and I think sometimes it can be deleterious for them simply because it's kind of enforced pleasure, which actually is no pleasure at all. So mixed feelings about that. But if somebody said to me, shall we keep it or shall we get rid of it, I'd say yes, let's keep it. I think for some students it's a case of finding what they want to read, and that doesn't necessarily have to be in a book. It certainly doesn't have to be fiction. We have to encompass that as well.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
This is Mrs. Riley, the school librarian, and I'm going to interview her about reading. How do you think reading benefits children?
Well, it's a life skill, so it's something that most of us need, and most importantly, the more you read, the bigger your vocabulary becomes and the more that you understand words. And I always tell students that if the more they read, they'll be able to interpret things like exam questions and form phrases to answer the questions. So I think it helps them in two ways at least. That's increasing their vocabulary and also learning a life skill that they'll need.
How do you think having one English lesson per fortnight, just reading, is beneficial?
Well, there has to be some area in school where reading is promoted, and English is the most natural subject for that. And also it helps children have a look at the different types of writing, whether it's prose or instructional writing, or whether it's poetry or stories, and that's most sort of it goes well with English, and some of the work that they do will bounce off that. But also there should be an opportunity for every student to be encouraged to read, because it doesn't always happen at home. And again, as we've said, it's a life skill and it actually benefits all the subjects that they do.
What is the year that you feel borrows the most books?
That's a difficult one, because the interesting thing is, obviously when people borrow books, you don't know whether they've actually read them when they bring them back. So that's quite interesting. But apart from that, the people that take out the most books are probably year 7, followed by year 8. But there's also a lot of sixth formers now borrowing books, because we've made a special effort to have revision guides and things. So I would say year 7, because they have a lesson in the library every fortnight. We often find that they use the library at breaks and lunchtime, so they're more familiar with the library and they're more likely to be encouraged to take books out. But both years 7 and 8 are expected to have a reading book on them, whether it's from home or from school.
Do you think our school library could be improved in any way?
Well, there's always room for improvement. I think for me, what I would like to see is an introduction of library helpers to the library. But in order to do that, we would have to A, have time to train them, and B, we'd have to have quite calm lunch times where we weren't controlling behaviour. So we'd have to look, and we are currently we'll be looking at the way lunch times work. Because obviously if you have library helpers, you'd want to train them up and you'd want them to issue books and you'd want them to take part in the library. And you'd have to develop a scheme where, you know, you'd start off perhaps with some duties, and if people carried on, they would have more responsibility. But we couldn't do that the way that lunchtimes operate at the moment. It's too busy, and often children don't make a conscious decision to come into the library, they just drift in. So sometimes it's not a working atmosphere, which it should be. And I think when we get that right, we might end up having, you know, library helpers, which I think would be great.
Do you find in which the library books are borrowed, like scanning cards, are easier than sort of previous methods that libraries have used?
Right, okay. Well, technology is wonderful when it works. Right? So there are occasions when it doesn't work. So that's the bit where scanning cards perhaps wouldn't be as easy, because then it causes you a problem and you have to go back to pen and paper. Having said that, in the old days we had this system called Brown's system, where you physically had a ticket and you physically had the book card from the book card and you put it in a tray. And with technology it's much easier for things like books that you reserve, because if you came to me and you reserved a book, in the old days I'd have had to search through perhaps 4 or 5 trays of tickets to find that book and put a note in it to give it to Annie when it came back. With technology, that's much quicker. And also, we did have it happen once or twice. You know, the tray gets knocked over on the floor and it's in date order, and there's no way that, you know, you can recreate that. You get in a bit of a mess. So there are advantages with both ways, but technology is much quicker.
Do you feel as if the amount of books borrowed from the library has decreased due to the amount of technology?
Well, that's interesting because I wouldn't say that the amount of books has decreased in fiction, even though we have people who have Kindles. I do think perhaps that from a different point of view, that the non-fiction or information books, obviously most classes in this school have computers, so perhaps the non-fiction books aren't borrowed as much, and they're not borrowed as much as they used to be for hobbies, because when I first came to this school people had different hobbies like knitting and sports, collecting things, model making. But because there's so many Xboxes and that type of thing at home, people aren't having the same hobbies, it's technology. So from that point of view, yes. But having said that, I think we get more projects, more structured use of the information books from lessons in school.
And do you ever think that books will be completely unused and unheard of because of technology?
Well, no, not really, because if you're talking about the internet, a lot of what's on the internet is unpublished. And a lot of what's in book form is something that somebody has published. And academic libraries like universities and even schools will have books that aren't available. Not everything's available on the internet, and it's not all that. I mean, publishers have to give their permission if their book is going to be fully available on the internet, and a lot of them don't do that. But it depends what you mean by a book, because you can still have a physical book. If you mean a physical book in a library, then I think those will always exist. But you also get physical books on the internet. The actual writing of a piece of work can be called a book if it's long enough. So I don't think people will still be writing in 50, 100, 200 years' time, and they may be writing something as long or as complicated that we would call it a book. But I still think a lot of people say to me that have Kindles that they still like physical books, and that it's a different experience, and it's more difficult to curl up with a Kindle than it is with a book. So I think there's a place for both. I don't think technology has to fight libraries. I think it can be used. We use technology here. We have a computerised library system. We have a computerised catalogue, which means that searching is a lot easier. I was talking about reserving a book. That's simple. We send out our overdues instead of having to write a little hand note to every student for an overdue book. We email it, which is a lot quicker. So I don't think technology has to fight libraries. Libraries, actually, the most important thing with libraries is not that they necessarily lend out books and have books, is that they serve their community. So a school library will serve its school community, a public library serves the public, a hospital library serves a hospital. So I think that's uppermost, and I think it's not always about how many books are taken out, or if the library has particular books that are needed. I think it's about serving the needs of the community.
That's everything, thank you.